In 1888, authorities found a 500-pound woman who hadn't left her bed in 10 years. 6 children had been born in that house. All died before age 5. The father was never named until the shocking confession that revealed a truth too dark for rural Tennessee to comprehend. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The Garrett farmhouse stood at the very edge of Hawkins County, Tennessee, where civilization gave way to wilderness. It was a structure that seemed to repel visitors through sheer atmosphere alone. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving gray, weathered boards that matched the color of storm clouds. Windows that once welcomed light now stared out like dead eyes, their glass coated with years of accumulated grime. The front porch sagged dangerously to one side, its boards rotted through in places that made approaching the front door a calculated risk. Neighbors kept their distance, not just because of the house's decrepit state, but because of what lived inside. Or rather, who lived inside. The Garrett siblings had inherited the property from their parents 12 years earlier, in 1876, and in that time, the place had transformed from a modest but respectable farm into something that inspired dread in anyone who passed by on the nearby road. Ida Garrett was spoken of only in whispers. Those whispers said she was massive, grotesquely large, confined to her bed by her own weight. No one in town could remember the last time they'd actually seen her. Some of the younger residents weren't even sure she existed, thinking perhaps she was just a ghost story the older folks used to frighten children into good behavior. But the older residents knew better. They remembered Ida from before, when she'd been a quiet, ordinary young woman who kept to herself and her brother. It was Moses Garrett who made the occasional appearances in town, and these visits were enough to keep the rumors about his sister alive and growing. He was a scarecrow of a man, all sharp angles and protruding bones, with skin that seemed stretched too tight across his skull. His eyes sat deep in their sockets, creating shadows that made it difficult to read his expression. When he spoke, which was rarely, his voice came out thin and reedy, like wind through a crack in a wall. Moses came to town perhaps once a month, always for the same purposes. He'd visit the general store to purchase supplies, heavy sacks of flour, cornmeal, and other staples that he'd load onto his wagon with surprising strength for someone who looked half-starved. He'd stop by the county office when necessary, always for the same grim task. And he'd return home, speaking to no one, no, unless absolutely required, acknowledging no greetings, meeting no eyes. The townspeople had learned not to approach him. There was something about Moses that warned people away, an intensity that radiated from him, like heat from a stove. Children would hide behind their mothers' skirts when his wagon rolled past. Men would find sudden interest in their shoes or the contents of shop windows. Even the dogs seemed to sense something wrong about him, falling silent and slinking away when he appeared. But it wasn't Moses alone that kept people away from the Garrett property. It was the pattern that had emerged over the years, a pattern that everyone noticed, but no one wanted to acknowledge too directly. 6 times in 12 years, Moses had appeared at the county office to register a birth. 6 times, he'd returned within 5 years to register a death. Always a child. Always his sister's child. Always with the same explanations delivered in that thin, emotionless voice: fever, weakness, failure to thrive. The county clerk had grown increasingly uncomfortable with each registration. But what could he do? Death was common enough in rural Tennessee, especially among children. Disease swept through communities with terrible regularity. But 6 children, all from the same household, all dying young, and no doctor ever called to attend them? It struck wrong. It felt wrong. Yet without proof of wrongdoing, without someone willing to make a formal complaint, the authorities could do nothing but accept Moses's reports and file the death certificates. And so the Garrett farmhouse stood, isolated and avoided, while inside its rotting walls, something terrible continued year after year, hidden from the world by distance, fear, and the community's reluctance to confront what they suspected but could not prove. The pattern had begun in 1877, just 1 year after the Garrett siblings inherited their parents' farm. Moses appeared at the county office on a cold March morning, his wagon rattling down the main street of town. He entered the building with his characteristic silence and informed the clerk in that flat, emotionless voice that his sister had given birth to a daughter. The child's name was Sarah. The clerk, a man named Howard Banks, had asked the obvious question: who was the father? Moses stared at him with those hollow eyes and said the father was gone, that he'd left the county and wouldn't be returning. The name he provided was John Miller, common enough to be anyone or no one. Banks recorded the information, though something about the encounter left him unsettled in ways he couldn't quite articulate. 3 years later, Moses returned. Sarah had died, he reported. Fever had taken her in the night. She'd been weak for some time, he explained, never quite thriving the way a child should. No doctor had been consulted, because by the time they realized how serious it was, the child was already gone. It happened so fast, Moses said, though his expression suggested no grief whatsoever. Banks accepted the report because he had no legal grounds to refuse it. Child mortality was tragically common. But he remembered that birth registration, remembered the odd feeling it had given him, and now that feeling returned stronger than before. In 1880, Moses registered another birth, a son this time, named Jacob. Same story about the father, different name, same claim that the man had left the county. Banks pressed harder this time, asking more questions. Where exactly had this man gone? What was his occupation? How long had he known Ida? Moses's answers were vague, contradictory in small ways that were hard to pinpoint, but impossible to ignore. Yet there was nothing actionable in contradictions and vagueness. Jacob lasted 4 years, longer than his sister. When Moses came to register the death in 1884, he reported the same cause: failure to thrive. The boy had always been sickly, Moses explained. He'd tried everything, but some children just weren't meant for this world. Banks found himself looking at Moses's skeletal frame, at the way his clothes hung on his body like fabric draped over a wire form, and wondering how anyone in that household could be properly fed. The births continued. Rebecca in 1881, dead by 1885. Thomas in 1883, dead by 1887. Each time, Moses appeared with the same mechanical efficiency, registering life and then death with equal detachment. Each time, the father was supposedly a different man, someone who'd passed through the county and left before the birth. The names were always common, the stories always thin, and Moses's demeanor always unsettling. By the time the 5th child was born in 1885, a girl named Ruth, the whispers in town had grown louder. People began to ask questions openly, though never directly to Moses. How could Ida keep having children when no one ever saw her with a man? How could she even be meeting men when she supposedly never left the house? And most disturbing of all, how could every single child born in that house die before reaching their 5th birthday? Some suggested disease, that perhaps there was something wrong with Ida herself that she passed to her children. Others whispered darker possibilities, theories about deliberate harm that they were afraid to voice too loudly. A few wondered if the children even existed at all, if perhaps Moses was registering false births and deaths for some incomprehensible purpose. But that theory died when Ruth was occasionally glimpsed through the grimy windows of the Garrett house, a pale little face appearing briefly before being pulled back into the shadows. Ruth died in 1888, just 3 years old. Moses registered her death with the same explanations he'd given for all the others: weakness, failure to thrive. Natural causes that struck with cruel consistency. The 6th child was born later that same year, a boy named Samuel. By this point, Banks had been keeping informal notes about the Garrett registrations, a growing file of births and deaths that formed a pattern too disturbing to ignore. He'd mentioned his concerns to the sheriff more than once, but without evidence of actual wrongdoing, there was nothing to be done. Suspicion wasn't grounds for investigation, especially when it came to a man's own household. Samuel lived only months. When Moses came to register the death in late 1888, something had changed in the town's tolerance for the pattern. Perhaps it was the speed of this death, or perhaps it was simply that the accumulation of loss had finally exceeded the community's ability to look away. Banks registered the death, but this time he did something he'd never done before. He contacted the state authorities, bypassing local channels entirely, and requested an investigation into the Garrett household. But it wasn't Banks who would finally break the case open. It was a schoolteacher named Margaret Ashford, who'd had a brief encounter with Thomas before his death. She'd seen something in that encounter that haunted her for years afterward. And when she heard about Samuel's death, she knew she could no longer remain silent. Her testimony to the authorities would be the catalyst that finally brought light into the darkness of the Garrett farmhouse. Margaret Ashford had been teaching at the Hawkins County Schoolhouse for 7 years when she encountered Thomas Garrett. It was a chance meeting on the road in the spring of 1886, about a year before the boy's death. She'd been walking back from visiting a student's family when she came upon Moses's wagon stopped at the side of the road, one of its wheels caught in a deep rut. Moses was struggling with the wheel, his skeletal frame inadequate for the task. In the back of the wagon sat a small boy, pulled perhaps 3 years old, watching with eyes that seemed far too large for his thin face. Margaret approached to offer assistance, as any decent person would, but Moses waved her away sharply. His tone was hostile, protective in a way that immediately struck her as excessive. But it was the boy who captured her attention. Thomas, she would later learn his name was. He sat perfectly still in the wagon bed, his small hands folded in his lap, his expression blank in a way that children's expressions should never be. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his skin had a pallor that spoke of insufficient sunlight and inadequate nutrition. When Margaret smiled at him, trying to offer some warmth, the boy didn't react. He simply stared, as though he'd forgotten how to respond to kindness. Margaret had seen poverty before. Rural Tennessee had no shortage of struggling families, children who went without enough food or proper clothing. But this was different. The boy's stillness was unnatural, learned rather than innate, and there was something in his eyes, a resignation that no 3-year-old should possess. It was the look of someone who'd already given up on the world. She'd tried to speak to the boy, asking his name, commenting on the weather. anything to provoke a normal, childlike response. Thomas opened his mouth as if to answer, but Moses cut him off immediately. The boy closed his mouth and looked down at his hands, and Margaret saw him tremble slightly. Not from cold, from something else entirely. Moses finally freed the wagon wheel and climbed back onto the seat. Before driving away, he turned to Margaret and told her, in that thin voice of his, that she should mind her own business. The Garrett family didn't need interference from outsiders. Then he snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving Margaret standing in the road with a sick feeling in her stomach. She'd reported the encounter to several people in town, expressing her concerns about the child's condition. But her words met with the same response Banks had received. Suspicion wasn't proof. The Garretts were known to be strange, but strange wasn't illegal. Without evidence of actual harm, nothing could be done. People suggested she was overreacting, that the boy was probably just shy, that poverty affected different families in different ways. Margaret tried to put the encounter out of her mind, but it lingered. She found herself thinking about Thomas at odd moments, wondering how he was, hoping he was somehow better than he'd appeared. When she heard about his death a year later, registered as failure to thrive, she felt a crushing guilt. She'd seen something wrong and hadn't pushed hard enough to help. So when Samuel died in late 1888, barely months after his birth, Margaret decided she would not remain silent again. She went directly to the county courthouse and demanded to speak with whoever would listen. She told them about her encounter with Thomas, describing in detail the boy's condition, his unnatural stillness, his obvious fear of his uncle. She talked about the pattern of deaths, about how every child born in that house died young, about how Moses controlled everything and no one ever saw Ida. Her testimony found a receptive audience this time, because Banks had already filed his concerns with state authorities. Margaret's first-hand account of actually seeing one of the children provided the concrete observation that had been missing. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was documented witness testimony about a child's condition before his death. The authorities faced a delicate situation. They needed to investigate, but they also needed to be careful. If they acted too aggressively and found nothing, they could face legal consequences for harassment. If they acted too timidly and more harm occurred, they would bear responsibility for inaction. They decided on a middle approach. They would visit the Garrett household under the guise of a routine welfare check, bringing medical soins, professionals who could assess the situation with trained eyes. Dr. Agnes Morrison volunteered to be part of the inspection team. She was one of only 3 female physicians in eastern Tennessee, a woman who'd fought hard for her medical degree and who took her professional responsibilities seriously. She'd heard the rumors about the Garrett household, and something about the pattern of deaths troubled her deeply from a medical perspective. 6 children, all dying before age 5, all supposedly from natural causes. It was statistically improbable, bordering on impossible. The team assembled in early November of 1888. Besides Dr. Morrison, it included Sheriff Frank Dalton, his deputy, and a representative from the State Welfare Office. They planned to arrive at the Garrett farmhouse unannounced, hoping to see the household in its natural state before Moses could prepare or hide anything. What none of them fully anticipated was just how horrifying natural state would prove to be. They were prepared for poverty, for neglect born of ignorance or inability. They were not prepared for the systematic, deliberate nature of what they were about to discover. The Garrett farmhouse held secrets that would haunt everyone who entered it for the rest of their lives. Truths so dark that even Margaret Ashford's worst suspicions would prove inadequate to the reality. The inspection team arrived at the Garrett farmhouse on a gray November morning, when fog still clung to the ground. Sheriff Dalton knocked firmly on the front door, the sound echoing hollowly through the structure. For a long moment, there was no response. Then they heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from inside. Moses opened the door only part way, his gaunt frame filling the narrow gap. His eyes moved from face to face, taking in the sheriff, the deputy, Dr. Morrison, and the welfare representative. His expression revealed nothing, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the door edge. Sheriff Dalton explained they were there to conduct a welfare check, that concerns had been raised about the household's well-being. Moses stood silently for several seconds before responding that everything was fine, that they had no need of outside interference. He began to close the door, but Dalton placed his boot against it. They could do this cooperatively, the sheriff explained, or they could return with a court order. The choice was Moses's. Something flickered across Moses's face then, some calculation being made. Finally, he stepped back and allowed them entry. The smell hit them immediately. It was the odor of unwashed bodies, of chamber pots left too long unemptied, of food gone bad, and mildew growing unchecked. Dr. Morrison pulled a handkerchief to her nose reflexively. The front room was sparse, containing only a few pieces of furniture covered in dust. It was clear this space hadn't been used in years. Moses led them through to the kitchen, which showed more signs of life, but also more signs of disturbing contrast. On one side of the room sat nearly empty shelves and a cold stove. On the other side sat sacks of flour, cornmeal, preserves, and other supplies. Enough food to feed a family for months, yet the cooking area suggested minimal meal preparation. "Where was his sister?" Dalton asked. Moses hesitated before gesturing toward a hallway. "She was in her room," he said. She hadn't been well for some time. Dr. Morrison asked what precisely was wrong with her, what symptoms she displayed. Moses's answer was vague. She was weak, he said. She tired easily. She preferred to stay in bed. They moved down the hallway, Moses leading with obvious reluctance. The floorboards creaked under their weight, and the walls showed water damage from a roof that clearly leaked. Moses stopped at a closed door and knocked softly before opening it. What lay beyond stopped everyone in their tracks. Ida Garrett occupied nearly the entire bed, her body of such enormous size that the mattress sagged dangerously in the middle. The room reeked of sweat and waste. The woman's face was pale and round. Her breathing labored even in rest. Her eyes opened slowly as they entered, showing confusion and fear in equal measure. Dr. Morrison approached the bed, introducing herself gently. Ida's gaze fixed on her with desperate intensity, as though the presence of another woman was something she'd almost forgotten could exist. The doctor asked basic questions about Ida's health, her daily routine, when she'd last been outside the room. Ida's answers came slowly, her voice rusty from disuse. She couldn't remember the last time she'd left the bed. Years, she thought. Maybe 10. Moses brought her food, she explained. Moses took care of everything. Her tone suggested both gratitude and something else, something that made Dr. Morrison's instincts flare with alarm. While Dr. Morrison spoke with Ida, the others explored the rest of the house. They found 2 other bedrooms, both small and barren. One appeared to be Moses's, containing only a narrow cot and a single change of clothes. The other was completely empty, except for a small wooden box in the corner. Inside that box, they found 6 roughly carved toys. Simple things, the kind a parent might make for a child. A wooden horse, a small doll, a spinning top. The deputy also found something else. In the kitchen, hidden behind the sacks of flour, were 6 sets of small clothes, different sizes, different stages of wear, but all showing the same thing. They were far too large for the children who would have worn them. The smallest items would have fit a child of 5 or 6. But according to the records, none of the Garrett children had lived past 5. Sheriff Dalton returned to Ida's room where Dr. Morrison was conducting a more thorough examination, asking questions about the children. Ida's responses were fragmented, confused. She spoke about babies, about how Moses said they needed to be strong, about how they kept getting sick. She mentioned that Moses told her it was God's plan, that the weak ones had to go back to heaven. The doctor's examination revealed that Ida was severely malnourished in some ways, despite her size. Her body showed signs of deliberate overfeeding of specific foods while being deprived of essential nutrients. She had bed sores that had never been properly treated. Her muscle mass had atrophied from years of immobility. This wasn't simply a woman who'd become large from overeating. This was a woman who'd been systematically kept in this condition. Moses stood in the doorway throughout, watching everything with those hollow eyes. When Dalton asked him to explain the children's clothes, the toys, the pattern of deaths, Moses's response was calm and measured. "Children died," he said. "It was unfortunate, but natural. He'd done his best to care for them. His best simply hadn't been enough." But Dr. Morrison noticed something in how he answered. There was no grief in his voice, no regret, no emotion whatsoever. He spoke about the deaths of 6 children the way someone might discuss the weather, as simple facts requiring no feeling attached to them. She looked at Ida, at the fear in the woman's eyes when she glanced at her brother. She looked at the condition of the house, at the evidence of deprivation existing alongside apparent plenty. And she knew they needed to separate Ida from Moses immediately, to get her somewhere she could speak freely without his presence casting shadows over every word. Dr. Morrison arranged for Ida to be transported to the county hospital, citing immediate medical necessity. Moses protested, claiming his sister needed him, that she wouldn't survive without his care. The irony of his words wasn't lost on anyone present. Sheriff Dalton made it clear that Moses had no choice in the matter. Ida required professional medical attention, and she would receive it whether he approved or not. The process of moving Ida from her bed took 6 men and a specially reinforced stretcher. She wept throughout, calling for Moses in a voice that sounded more like a frightened child than a grown woman. He watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable, as they carried her out of the room she hadn't left in a decade. Once Ida was safely at the hospital, the real investigation began. Sheriff Dalton obtained a warrant to search the property thoroughly, and what they discovered over the next several days painted a picture of calculated cruelty that went far beyond simple neglect. In Moses's room, they found journals, years' worth of entries written in cramped, precise handwriting. The journals detailed everything: what food he'd given Ida each day, how much she weighed at various points, her physical condition, her mental state. The entries were clinical, devoid of affection or concern. They read like a farmer's notes about livestock, observations made for purely practical purposes. But it was the entries about the children that revealed the true horror of his method. Moses had recorded their births, their growth, their declining health. He'd noted when they became weak, when they stopped playing, when they could no longer stand without help. He'd documented it all, with the same detached precision he used for everything else. And in those pages, the pattern became impossible to deny. The children had been deliberately underfed. Moses had calculated exactly how much food would keep them alive, but slowly failing. He'd kept Ida immobilized and dependent, while systematically depriving the children of adequate nutrition. The journals showed he understood precisely what he was doing. This wasn't ignorance or inability to provide proper care. This was methodical, sustained deprivation carried out over years. The medical examination of Ida supported this conclusion. Dr. Morrison's detailed assessment revealed that Ida had been fed enormous quantities of simple starches and fats, while being denied proteins, vitamins, and minerals necessary for health. Her body had grown massive, while simultaneously being malnourished, a contradiction that could only result from deliberate manipulation of her diet. The examination also revealed something else. Ida had borne 6 children, but her body showed signs of trauma consistent with repeated childbirth without proper medical care. She'd delivered every baby alone with only Moses present, never seeing a doctor or midwife. The risks she'd survived were staggering, and the suffering she must have endured was almost unimaginable. Dr. Morrison spent hours with Ida over several days, slowly earning her trust, creating an environment where the terrified woman might feel safe enough to speak truthfully. The hospital staff provided Ida with proper nutrition for the first time in years, treated her bed sores, and showed her the basic human kindness that had been absent from her life for so long. Gradually, fragments of truth began to emerge. Ida spoke about how Moses controlled everything, how he decided what she ate, when she ate, whether she could have water or access to basic hygiene. She mentioned how he'd told her the children needed to be disciplined, that they couldn't be coddled, or they'd become weak. She recalled him taking the children away when they cried, bringing them back silent and compliant. She talked about living in that room year after year, watching her body change, feeling herself become trapped not just by the walls, but by her own physical form. Moses had convinced her that her size was her fault, that she lacked self-control, that she was fortunate he was willing to care for someone so pathetic. He'd told her repeatedly that without him, she would die. The authorities also examined the financial records of the Garrett household. Moses had controlled all money from their parents' estate. He'd managed the property, sold off portions of the farm over the years, and maintained complete authority over every resource. Ida had no independent access to funds, no ability to seek help or leave, even if she'd been physically capable of doing so. Analysis of the property revealed more disturbing details. The children's room had a lock on the outside. The kitchen showed evidence of separate food storage, with certain items kept in a locked cabinet that only Moses could access. The house's layout ensured that anyone in Ida's room would be completely cut off from the outside world, unable to see or communicate with anyone unless Moses permitted it. Most damning of all were the toys they'd found. When examined more closely, they showed signs of having been used very little. The wooden horse's paint was barely worn. The doll's dress was nearly pristine. These were objects that had been available to the children, but that they'd apparently lacked the energy or interest to play with much. They were props in Moses's performance of providing care, evidence he could point to if questioned, while the reality was that the children were too weak to enjoy them. The picture that emerged was one of absolute control maintained through physical isolation, psychological manipulation, and systematic deprivation. Moses had created a closed system where he decided every aspect of existence for everyone in that household. He'd kept Ida trapped and dependent, and he'd ensured the children never grew strong enough to escape or seek help. It was domination so complete that it had required no physical restraints beyond those he'd engineered through starvation and forced immobility. And through it all, Moses had maintained a facade of normalcy to the outside world, registering births and deaths, making his trips to town, presenting himself as a man dealing with unfortunate circumstances rather than orchestrating them. The system had worked for 12 years, allowing 6 children to die while the community suspected but did nothing. Now, finally, the truth was emerging into daylight. On the 4th day of Ida's hospitalization, Dr. Morrison arrived to find her patient in a state of extreme agitation. Ida had been awake most of the night, the nurses reported, crying softly and calling out names. The names of her children. Dr. Morrison dismissed the nurses and closed the door, sensing that something was about to break through the walls of silence and shame that Ida had built around herself. She sat beside the bed and waited. Sometimes, the most important thing a doctor could do was simply be present, creating a space where truth could finally breathe. Ida's hands twisted the bedsheet, pulling and releasing, pulling and releasing. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. Finally, she spoke. The babies weren't from different men. There had never been any other men. Moses had lied in all those registrations, inventing names and stories to satisfy the legal requirements. The truth was something Ida had been too ashamed and too terrified to speak for 12 years. Dr. Morrison felt her stomach turn, but she kept her expression neutral and compassionate. She needed Ida to continue, to speak the unspeakable, so that justice might finally be possible. She reached out and took Ida's hand, holding it gently, and told her she was safe now. Whatever she needed to say, she could say it here. Ida's story emerged in fragments, often circling back on itself as she struggled to explain what had happened. After their parents died in 1876, she and Moses had been alone on the farm. She'd been 22 years old. He'd been 28. They'd always been close, closer than most siblings, partly because they'd been somewhat isolated growing up. Their parents had kept to themselves, and that isolation had continued after their deaths. Moses had changed after the funeral. He'd become more controlling, more insistent about what Ida should do, how she should behave. He'd told her they needed to be careful with their money, that they couldn't afford to hire help or allow visitors who might take advantage of them. Gradually, he'd isolated her from the few social connections she'd maintained. Then, about a year after their parents' deaths, Moses had come to her with a strange conviction. He'd told her that God had spoken to him, that they'd been given a sacred duty. Their bloodline was pure, he'd said, untainted by the corruption of the outside world. It was their responsibility to preserve that purity, to continue their family line without contamination from outsiders who would weaken what their ancestors had built. Ida had been confused and frightened by his words, but Moses had been insistent. He'd quoted scripture, twisted and reinterpreted to support his claims. He'd spoken about biblical figures, about how the rules that applied to common people didn't apply to those chosen for special purposes. He'd told her that what seemed wrong to small minds was actually righteous in God's eyes. She'd refused initially, horrified by what he was suggesting. But Moses hadn't accepted her refusal. He'd begun restricting her food, telling her she needed to learn obedience, that pride and stubbornness were sins she needed to overcome. When she'd tried to leave the house, she'd found he'd hidden her shoes, her coat, anything she might need to go into town. When she'd threatened to tell someone, he'd reminded her that no one would believe her, that everyone would think she was mad, that she'd be locked away in an asylum. The isolation, the manipulation, the gradual erosion of her will had finally broken her resistance. She'd submitted to what Moses claimed was God's plan. Sarah had been born 9 months later, and after Sarah's birth, Moses had begun the pattern that would continue for 12 years. He'd started overfeeding Ida systematically, claiming she needed to rebuild her strength. But the food kept coming, and her body kept growing, until she could no longer move easily, could no longer contemplate escape. With each pregnancy, he'd repeated his claims about divine purpose. He'd told her the children were proof of God's blessing, that they were building something pure and sacred. But when the children failed to thrive, when they became weak and sickly, Moses's attitude had changed. He'd said they were being tested, that only the strong deserved to survive, that weakness was a sign of spiritual failure. Ida had watched her children die one by one, too trapped by her own body and her brother's control to save them. She'd begged Moses to get help, to bring a doctor, to feed the children more. He'd told her she was being hysterical, that she didn't understand what was necessary. He'd claimed the children's suffering was cleansing them, preparing them for heaven, that interfering with God's judgment would be blasphemy. She'd loved her children desperately despite everything. She'd tried to comfort them in their final days, holding them when Moses allowed it, singing to them, promising them peace. But she'd been powerless to stop what was happening. Her body had become her prison, and Moses had been the warden who controlled every aspect of existence within those walls. Dr. Morrison listened to it all, taking notes, documenting every detail. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote, but her voice remained steady and calm. She assured Ida that what had happened wasn't her fault, that she'd been a victim of terrible manipulation and abuse, that she'd been trapped in circumstances no person should have to endure. But even as she spoke those comforting words, Dr. Morrison knew the legal reality would be more complicated. Ida had been an adult when this began. She'd participated, however coerced, in registering the births and remaining silent about the deaths. The question of her culpability versus her victimhood would be debated, and the answers wouldn't be simple or satisfying. What was clear beyond doubt was Moses's guilt. He'd orchestrated everything, controlled everything, caused everything. He was responsible for 6 deaths and years of suffering. And now that the truth was finally spoken, now that Ida's confession was documented and witnessed, there could be no more hiding behind vague explanations and thin lies. Sheriff Dalton would need to arrest Moses immediately. But when they went to do so the next morning, they discovered something that would complicate everything. Moses Garrett had disappeared. Sheriff Dalton arrived at the Garrett farmhouse at dawn with a warrant for Moses's arrest and 4 deputies to ensure there would be no escape. They found the front door standing open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. Inside, the house was empty. Moses had taken almost nothing with him. His few possessions remained in his room. His journals still sat where investigators had found them. He'd simply walked away into the wilderness that surrounded the property. The search began immediately. Dalton organized tracking parties, brought in dogs, and enlisted local men who knew the terrain, the Appalachian Mountains, that rose behind the Garrett property were vast and unforgiving, filled with caves, ravines, and dense forest that could hide a man indefinitely if he knew what he was doing. And Moses, having lived his entire life on that farm, knew the mountains better than most. The dogs picked up his scent leading away from the house toward the tree line, but lost it at a creek about 2 miles into the woods. Moses had walked in the water, a basic but effective method of throwing off pursuit. From that point, he could have gone in any direction. The search parties fanned out, checking known trails, caves, and hunting shelters that dotted the mountains. They found nothing. No tracks, no signs of passage, no indication of which direction he'd taken. It was as if Moses had been absorbed by the wilderness itself, becoming one with the rocks and trees. The skeletal man who'd seemed so fragile had proven remarkably capable of survival in conditions that would challenge even experienced woodsmen. Days stretched into weeks. The search parties grew smaller as volunteers returned to their own lives and responsibilities. Winter was approaching, and the mountains would soon become even more treacherous. Some suggested Moses had already died out there, that his body would eventually be found by chance, years later, just bones scattered among the leaves. Others weren't so sure. There was something about Moses that suggested a capacity for endurance that his appearance belied. The community's reaction to his disappearance was complex. There was relief that he was gone, that he could no longer harm anyone. But there was also fear. As long as Moses remained at large, people felt unsafe. Parents kept their children closer. Women traveling alone took precautions they hadn't considered necessary before. The idea that he might be out there, watching from the tree line, possibly planning some kind of revenge, haunted the collective imagination. Sightings were reported occasionally. A hunter claimed to have seen a thin figure moving through the woods at dusk. A family traveling a remote mountain road reported a man matching Moses's description watching them from a hillside before disappearing into the forest. Whether these sightings were real or products of fearful minds was impossible to determine. The authorities investigated each report, but never found anything concrete. The state offered a reward for information leading to Moses's capture. Wanted posters went up in towns throughout eastern Tennessee and into neighboring states. His description was circulated: skeletal build, hollow eyes, approximately 6 feet tall, last seen wearing dark clothing. But the reward went unclaimed. Moses remained a ghost, present in rumor, but absent in fact. Some theorized he'd left the mountains entirely, that he'd used the wilderness only as an initial escape route before making his way to another town where he could start over under a different identity. But those who'd seen Moses, who'd looked into those hollow eyes and felt the intensity that radiated from him, didn't believe he'd integrated back into civilized society. Whatever he'd become, whatever darkness had driven him to do what he'd done, it seemed incompatible with normal life among normal people. Dr. Morrison visited Ida regularly and asked if she had any idea where Moses might have gone. Did he have hiding places in the mountains? Places he'd mentioned or taken her to before her confinement? But Ida had no useful information to offer. She'd been isolated for so long that any knowledge she might have once possessed about the surrounding area was years out of date. What Ida did say, though, haunted everyone who heard it. She told Dr. Morrison that Moses wouldn't leave the mountains, that he'd always said the land was in his blood, that he belonged to it as much as it belonged to him. She said he'd spoken sometimes about the purity of the wilderness, about how civilization corrupted everything it touched, about how the mountains were the only place left that remained true to God's original vision. Those statements suggested Moses had gone into the wilderness not as a desperate fugitive seeking temporary refuge, but as someone returning to what he considered his natural element. It suggested he might survive out there indefinitely, living off the land, avoiding human contact, existing in a state that was more animal than man. The legal proceedings continued without him. Ida was charged as an accessory to the children's deaths, but a judge, after reviewing Dr. Morrison's detailed testimony about her physical and mental condition, determined she wasn't competent to stand trial. She was remanded to a state asylum for care and observation. The house was seized by the county to cover legal costs and to ensure Moses could never return to it. As autumn turned to winter, the search for Moses Garrett officially ended. He was declared a fugitive, his case left open, but no longer actively pursued. The mountains swallowed the falling snow, covering tracks and trails, making any search impossible until spring. By then, most people assumed Moses would either be found dead or would have disappeared so completely that finding him would be hopeless. But the story of what happened in the Garrett farmhouse spread beyond Hawkins County. Newspapers picked it up, each retelling adding its own embellishments and theories. Some painted Moses as a monster, others as a madman, still others as something in between. The truth, as documented in Dr. Morrison's careful notes and the sheriff's reports, was terrible enough without embellishment. And somewhere in those vast mountains, Moses Garrett continued his existence, his fate and whereabouts unknown to everyone but himself, and perhaps the wilderness that had claimed him. The state asylum where Ida was placed sat on a hill overlooking a small river valley, about 40 miles from Hawkins County. It was a newer facility, built only 5 years earlier, with the intention of providing humane treatment for those whose minds had been broken by trauma or illness. The staff were trained to see their patients as people deserving of dignity rather than simply problems to be contained. Ida arrived in December of 1888, transported by wagon on a journey that took most of a day. She wept throughout the trip, not from physical pain, but from a grief that seemed to pour out of her in waves now that she was no longer in Moses's presence. Dr. Morrison accompanied her, wanting to ensure the asylum staff understood the complexity of Ida's situation. The asylum's head physician, Dr. Samuel Warren, listened carefully to Morrison's account and examined the extensive notes she'd compiled. He'd treated victims of abuse before, but the systematic nature of what Ida had endured was unlike anything in his experience. He assured Morrison that Ida would receive the best care possible, though he was honest about the prognosis. The damage done to her, both physical and psychological, might well be irreversible. Initially, the staff focused on Ida's physical health. They put her on a carefully controlled diet designed to reduce her weight gradually while ensuring proper nutrition. They treated her bed sores and worked to improve her mobility, helping her sit up in bed for increasing periods each day. The physical improvements came slowly but steadily. Within 3 months, Ida had lost nearly 50 pounds and could sit without assistance for an hour at a time. But her mental state proved far more resistant to healing. Ida rarely spoke, except to whisper the names of her children: Sarah, Jacob, Rebecca, Thomas, Ruth, Samuel. The names came like a litany, repeated over and over, as though by speaking them, she could somehow keep them alive in memory, if not in fact. The asylum staff tried various approaches to reach her. They encouraged her to talk about her feelings, to express the anger and grief that clearly consumed her. They provided her with needlework, thinking that productive activity might give her purpose. They read to her from the Bible, hoping religious comfort might ease her anguish. Nothing worked. Ida remained locked inside herself, present in body, but absent in any meaningful way. Dr. Warren documented her condition meticulously. He noted that she seemed to be suffering from what he termed profound melancholia, a depression so deep that it affected every aspect of her functioning. She ate when food was brought to her, but showed no interest in it. She slept fitfully, often waking in the night crying out for her children or calling for Moses. When asked what she wanted Moses for, she couldn't articulate it, only saying she needed to tell him something, that there was something important he needed to understand. The staff found this attachment to her abuser troubling, but not uncommon. They'd seen it before in women who'd suffered long-term mistreatment from husbands or family members. The bonds, formed through years of control and manipulation, didn't simply dissolve because the victim was removed from the situation. Ida's entire adult life had been defined by Moses's presence and control. Without him, she seemed not to know who she was or how to exist. As 1889 progressed, Ida's physical health continued to improve, even as her mental state deteriorated. She lost more weight, regaining some mobility, even walking short distances with assistance. But she seemed to take no pleasure or interest in these improvements. She moved through the days like a ghost, present, but not participating in life. Dr. Morrison visited monthly, hoping to see progress, but instead witnessing decline. She'd grown fond of Ida despite the terrible circumstances of their meeting. She wanted to believe that given time and care, this broken woman might find some measure of peace, but with each visit, that hope dimmed. In the autumn of 1890, Ida's physical decline began. She started refusing food more often, having to be coaxed to eat even small amounts. She developed a cough that persisted despite treatment. Her weight loss, which had been gradual and healthy, accelerated in an unhealthy way. She was wasting, the doctors agreed, not from disease, but from a simple lack of will to continue living. By early 1891, Ida was bedridden again, not from her size, but from weakness. The pneumonia that finally took her in March of that year was almost a mercy. She'd lived 3 years after leaving the Garrett farmhouse, but they'd been years of suffering rather than recovery, years spent trapped in memories she couldn't escape. In her final days, she became slightly more lucid, speaking in fragments about her children. She told the nurse attending her that she'd tried to save them, that she'd wanted to save them, but she hadn't been strong enough. She said Moses had promised they'd all be together again in heaven, all 8 of them, a pure family untouched by the world's corruption. Her final words, spoken just before dawn on March 14th, 1891, were the name of her first child, Sarah. Then she closed her eyes and didn't open them again. She was 37 years old. Dr. Warren wrote in his final notes that Ida Garrett had died of pneumonia, complicated by profound melancholia and failure to thrive. But privately, he told Dr. Morrison that Ida had died of something simpler and more tragic. She'd died of grief and shame, and a broken spirit that no amount of physical care could repair. There was no family to claim her body, no one to arrange a funeral. The asylum buried her in their cemetery, a small plot set aside for patients who died with no one to mourn them. Her grave marker bore only her name and dates. No epitaph attempted to summarize the tragedy of her life. Dr. Morrison attended the burial, one of only 3 people present. She stood in the cold spring rain and thought about the 6 children who'd never had proper burials, who'd been buried quickly in unmarked graves on the Garrett property. She thought about how Ida had loved them desperately, but hadn't been able to save them. And she thought about Moses, still out there somewhere, alive or dead, and how justice had never truly been served. The case remained officially open, but Ida's death marked a kind of ending nonetheless. The last direct victim of Moses Garrett's cruelty had finally escaped, though escape had come only through death. 15 years passed before anyone learned what became of Moses Garrett. The story of the Garrett farmhouse faded from immediate memory, though it remained part of local legend, the kind of dark tale people told on winter nights to remind themselves that evil sometimes wore familiar faces. In October of 1903, 2 hunters named Jacob Hendricks and Thomas Pruitt were tracking a wounded deer deep into the Appalachian wilderness, far beyond the usual hunting grounds. The deer's blood trail led them up a steep ravine and into a section of the mountains that few people ventured into anymore. The terrain was treacherous, the paths uncertain, and there were easier places to hunt. But Hendricks and Pruitt were experienced woodsmen who'd grown up in these mountains, and they were determined not to let an animal suffer unnecessarily. They followed the trail until it led them to the entrance of a cave, partially hidden by overgrown brush and a fallen tree. The deer had gone inside, and they followed carefully, carrying lanterns to light the darkness. The cave opened into a larger chamber about 20 feet in. The deer lay dead near the back wall, its suffering finally ended. But what caught the hunter's attention wasn't the deer. It was what else occupied that chamber. A human skeleton lay curled against the cave wall, still wearing rotted clothing. The bones were small, the frame slight, suggesting someone who'd been thin even in life. Near the skeleton lay the remains of a worn Bible, its pages too damaged by moisture and time to be readable. And scattered around the chamber were 6 wooden crosses, each about a foot tall, carefully carved and arranged in a neat row. The hunters approached cautiously, their initial alarm fading as they realized whoever this had been was long dead. Hendricks knelt beside the skeleton, examining the clothing, looking for anything that might identify the remains. In what was left of a coat pocket, he found a small piece of paper, folded and tucked away, as though meant to be protected. The paper was barely legible, but enough words remained to make out a list of names and dates. Sarah, Jacob, Rebecca, Thomas, Ruth, Samuel. Pruitt recognized those names immediately. Everyone in Hawkins County who'd been around 15 years ago knew those names. They were the Garrett children, the 6 who'd died before the truth about their household had been revealed. This skeleton, lying in a remote cave surrounded by carefully carved crosses, could only be Moses Garrett. The hunters marked the location and hiked back to town, reporting their discovery to the current sheriff. A recovery team was organized, and 2 days later, they brought Moses's remains out of the mountains, along with the crosses and the few other items found in the cave. Dr. Morrison, now in her 60s, but still practicing medicine in the area, was asked to examine what could be determined from the remains. She confirmed the skeleton was male, the size consistent with Moses Garrett's description. The age of the bones suggested death had occurred many years earlier, possibly not long after his disappearance in 1888. But it was the cause of death that proved most significant. The bones showed no signs of violence or injury. The cave had shown no evidence of accident or animal attack. What the cave did show was a complete absence of food supplies, hunting equipment, or anything that might have sustained life. Moses had gone into that cave and simply stayed there, allowing himself to waste away. The 6 crosses told their own story. Each was carved with remarkable care, despite the crude tools Moses must have had available. Each bore a name and 2 dates, birth and death, carved in letters that remained legible even after years of cave dampness. The crosses were arranged in order by birth, oldest to youngest, creating a memorial that Moses had been the only one to see. What had driven him to create this memorial? Remorse? Grief? Some twisted sense of righteousness? The answers died with him in that cave. But the fact that he'd spent what must have been his final days carving those crosses suggested that the children had occupied his thoughts to the end. The forensics of his death painted a grim picture. Based on the condition of the remains and the cave environment, investigators concluded Moses had deliberately starved himself. He'd gone into the mountains after his crimes were discovered, found this remote cave, and decided it would be his final resting place. He'd carved the crosses first, probably taking days or weeks to complete them. Then he'd simply stopped eating, allowing his body to fail in the same way he'd caused 6 children's bodies to fail. Whether this was suicide driven by guilt or some other motivation remained unclear. Some argued it was evidence that Moses had finally understood what he'd done, that conscience had caught up with him, and he'd chosen to punish himself. Others suggested it was something else entirely, perhaps a continuation of his twisted religious beliefs, a sacrifice he thought would somehow purify him or reunite him with his victims in whatever afterlife he imagined. The community's reaction to the discovery was mixed. There was relief in knowing Moses was truly gone, that he could never hurt anyone again. There was also a strange sense of anticlimax. He'd escaped earthly justice, dying on his own terms rather than facing trial and punishment. The closure his death provided was incomplete, leaving too many questions unanswered. Moses Garrett was buried without ceremony in the county potter's field, in an unmarked grave far from his sister's resting place. The 6 wooden crosses were kept as evidence and eventually placed in storage at the county courthouse, grim artifacts of a tragedy that had claimed 8 lives in total. The cave where he died became known locally as Garrett's Cave, though few people ventured there. It remained a place of dark history, shunned by superstitious locals who believed some places absorbed the evil that occurred within them. Dr. Morrison wrote extensively about the case in her private journals, trying to make sense of what had driven Moses to do what he'd done. She never found satisfactory answers. Some people, she concluded, contained darkness that couldn't be fully understood or explained. Moses Garrett had been one of those people, and his death in that lonely cave had ended his story, but hadn't explained it. The discovery of his remains closed the official case, but it didn't close the book on what had happened in the Garrett farmhouse. That story still had one more chapter to be written, one more revelation waiting to emerge from the shadows of history. Dr. Agnes Morrison died in her sleep on January 3, 1924, at the age of 81. She'd practiced medicine for nearly 50 years, treating thousands of patients, earning respect and admiration throughout eastern Tennessee. Her funeral was well attended. Her obituary praised her dedication and compassion. But what she left behind in her private papers would ensure her legacy extended far beyond her medical accomplishments. Morrison had never married, had no children, and her closest living relative was a niece named Catherine, who lived in Knoxville. Catherine inherited Morrison's house and possessions, including decades of accumulated papers, journals, and medical records. The task of sorting through her aunt's estate was overwhelming. There were boxes upon boxes of documents, letters, case notes, and personal writings. Catherine began the sorting process methodically, working through the papers room by room. In Morrison's study, in a locked cabinet whose key had been kept in Morrison's personal effects, Catherine found a collection of journals that immediately caught her attention. They were labeled by year, beginning in 1888 and continuing through Morrison's retirement in 1918. These weren't ordinary medical journals. They were detailed personal accounts of Morrison's most significant cases, written not for professional purposes, but for historical record. Morrison had documented cases she believed future generations needed to know about, situations that revealed important truths about human nature, society's failures, and the systems that allowed harm to flourish unchecked. The Garrett case occupied an entire journal, the 1888 volume. Morrison had documented everything with meticulous care. Every conversation with Ida, every detail discovered during the investigation. every observation about Moses's methods and motivations. She'd included transcripts of Ida's confession, descriptions of the farmhouse conditions, analysis of Moses's journals, and her own professional and personal reflections on what it all meant. What made these notes extraordinary was their completeness. Morrison had recorded details that never made it into official reports, observations that seemed too disturbing for public consumption, and her own theories about the psychological mechanisms that had allowed such horror to continue for 12 years. She'd written about the community's complicity through willful ignorance, the legal system's inadequacy in protecting vulnerable people, and the particular dangers of isolated households where absolute power went unchecked. Catherine read the Garrett Journal with growing horror and fascination. She'd heard stories about the case growing up, but they'd been sanitized versions, leaving out the most disturbing elements. Morrison's account revealed the full truth in all its terrible detail. She'd documented not just what happened, but why it happened, how it happened, and what it meant for understanding human capacity for evil. The journal also contained something Catherine hadn't expected. In the final entries, written in 1923, just months before Morrison's death, the elderly doctor had reflected on the Garrett case from the perspective of 35 years' distance. She'd written about how the case had shaped her understanding of trauma, abuse, and the long-term effects of systematic control. She'd expressed regret that she hadn't been able to save Ida, but also pride that at least the truth had been documented and justice partially served. Morrison had written that she was preserving these notes specifically so the Garrett children wouldn't be forgotten, so their brief lives and terrible deaths would mean something. She wanted future generations to understand how easily society could fail its most vulnerable members, how patterns of harm could hide in plain sight when people chose not to look too closely. Catherine contacted the Tennessee Historical Society, offering Morrison's journals for their archives. The society eagerly accepted, recognizing their historical value. The Garrett Journal was among the most significant, providing unprecedented documentation of a case that had become legendary but poorly understood. When the journal was made available to researchers in 1925, it caused renewed interest in the Garrett case. Newspapers published articles based on Morrison's notes, finally telling the complete story. Criminologists and psychologists studied the case as an example of familial abuse and control. Social reformers used it to argue for better oversight of isolated households and stronger intervention systems, the six Garrett children, who'd died nameless and forgotten except as statistics in a county ledger, finally received recognition as real individuals who'd suffered and deserved to be remembered. Morrison's notes ensured their story wouldn't disappear into obscurity, that their deaths would serve as a warning and a lesson. The farmhouse where it all happened had long since been torn down, but a small memorial was erected near the site in 1926. It bore the names of all 6 children and a simple inscription: "May we never forget, and may we always protect the innocent." Dr. Morrison's careful documentation had accomplished what no trial could have achieved. It preserved the truth completely and permanently, ensuring that everyone who needed to be remembered would be, and that the lessons learned wouldn't be lost to time. The Garrett case stands as a reminder that evil often wears familiar faces, that horror can exist behind closed doors while communities go about their daily lives, and that silence in the face of suspicion can be as damaging as active participation in wrongdoing. It reminds us that 6 children died because people were afraid to act, because systems failed to protect, and because one man's madness went unchallenged for far too long. Their names were Sarah, Jacob, Rebecca, Thomas, Ruth, and Samuel. They deserved better than the short, suffering lives they lived. The least we can do is remember them and learn from their tragedy. This story isn't just history. It's a warning that's still relevant today. Behind doors you pass every day, suffering might be occurring while everyone looks the other way. The question isn't whether such darkness exists. The question is whether we'll have the courage to shine light on it when we suspect it's there. If this story disturbed you, good. It should. If it made you think about the children in your community, about the families you never quite see clearly, about the responsibility we all share to protect the vulnerable, then these 6 children didn't die completely in vain. Hit that like button if you believe we need to face these dark truths instead of hiding from them. Subscribe if you want more stories that expose the hidden horrors of history and make you question what's really happening around you. Because the Garretts aren't just a story from 1888. They're a pattern that repeats itself whenever good people decide that suspicion isn't enough reason to act. Don't be someone who looks away. Be someone who sees.